welcome to my presentation on communication networks and discourse analysis. My name is Hannah Tarundwa. I hope this presentation is going to be comprehensive. If you've got any other questions, feel free to write in the comments or just get in touch with me directly if you've got my contacts, or email me at hannaht@openucreativity.org. So I will begin looking at communication networks and really their origins. And of course, we all know Claude Shannon, or the Shannon-Weaver model of communication, where there was a source up until an encoder, right? And this was a mathematical way of showing how information moved and therefore how communication transpired. Of course, we're not going to go deep into this, but it's important to always remember that when discourses about communication started, it actually started from a mathematical angle. And so, yes, you find that, of course, there was the input from the source, and then a source encoder, channel encoder, all that, these processes that you see on the screen would happen until an output signal was happening. So this was actually connected to information technology. That's why you find Claude Shannon is called the father of information technology. But his model then went on to just move from just a mathematical to actually being relevant in the social sciences and our purpose of analyzing communication and discourse. Now, let me try to just define in the simplest of ways communication networks. So basically, networks are complex webs of interaction, and these are where people exchange information, ideas, and influence within or across various social, organizational, and technological domains. Right. I will also look at these two psychologists who were very, very concerned about communication networks. And these two are Harold Levitt, a management psychologist who believes that large groups require leadership, and Alex Pavelis, who also American, who looked at, or who came up with the closeness of centrality. And he was also a psychologist. And he said the closer you are to the center, the more networks you have. But these men, both of them, had a core focus when it came to communication networks. They looked at the power of discourse, and they agreed that language, text, and other symbolic forms are not just used to pass on information, but they're used to construct, negotiate, and transform meaning of information. So this is also part of our communication networks when we are looking at them. What is the meaning that's constructed? What's the meaning that's negotiated? And sometimes a meaning can be actually transformed. Now we're going to look at what is called network topology. Network topologies are basically communication networks that they take various topological structures. So they can either be centralized, decentralized, or distributed, as you can see in the diagram below. But the network architectures, that is, whoever starts the network is the one who determines the patterns of connectivity in most times. Of course, they might decide how they want information to flow. Is it top down? Is it sideways? Is it non-hierarchical? And the distribution of power and influence. The architects of that network will probably decide who reports to who and how, when, right? So, and that's the distribution of power within that actual system. So you've got these different types of topologies that you could, if you are an architect of a network, decide to use. Then there are nodes and ties. when it comes to communication network. So fundamental building blocks of communication networks are what we call nodes and ties. So nodes are the people, the individuals, the organizations, or the entities that are within the network. And then the ties, as you'll see from the document, the picture I'm going to show just now, are the relationships, the interactions, or information exchanges that connect them. It's important to understand the nature and dynamics of these nodes and ties because they can change, and it's crucial for analyzing the structure and function of communication networks. So, for example, let's look at Sarah, for example, on this document, in this image. Sarah could be Zara's boss, but Peter's subordinate. But for example, let's say Sarah decides to get to upgrade her qualifications. The boss, maybe Meher, might decide to update Sarah's status or profile, right, at her workplace. So she gets a promotion. Lo and behold, she'll either be equal to Pete or higher to Pete, and then Pete becomes the subordinate. You see, so the nature and the dynamics of these nodes, people change all the time, entities change. At one time one entity is borrowing from another, the next it's giving. So it's important to understand this when you're talking about communication networks and the impact of those changes. And then we're going to also look at network dynamics. So networks, they are always changing their shape, the way they are, it always changes. So you've got, like, for example, I've given this image of friendship networks, webs and citations, right? So, and even the internet, and including food web, who eats whom. I'm not really sure if ever an elephant will ever eat a lion, excuse me, but sometimes things change. So, for example, I watched a National Geographic video where a snake, who is supposed to be generally the attacker, is then attacked by a bird, and the snake ends up being the prey and not the hunter. So it can happen in some situations. But communication networks are inherently dynamic. They're always evolving and adapting over time. So, for example, maybe today you're best friends with Pete. Tomorrow, you're best friends with Sarah. You're no longer talking to Pete. That is a network that has changed. And these are the dynamics we're talking about. So there are factors such as the formation of new connections, the strengthening or weakening of existing ties, and of course, the emergence of new nodes and subgroups can significantly shape the network's overall structure and the way it behaves. Now I'm going to look at the role of discourse in communication networks. So discourse, discussion, and we're going to I'm going to look at three key ones, even though I believe there might be more. So number one, information sharing. A discourse within communication networks, of course, is basically to share information. Discourse means to discuss, to talk, to engage in the process of communication. And people exchange information, knowledge, ideas, and enable it enables the dissemination and collective understanding of critical information. So of course, you can get some information where within a group, 10 people understand it one way, 5 people understand it another, and maybe another 5 don't even understand it at all. But through discourse, you get to what we then call collective understanding, especially if it's critical information. For example, work policies, national policies, and some documents. So whilst one person can think that the meaning in a text is one way, it's important that everybody gets on the same page and they understand the same meaning, they see it the same way, right? And then negotiation and influence. Discourse always also serves as a medium for negotiating meanings, power dynamics, and social relationships within the network. This helps shape the way in which individuals and groups influence each other's beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. So, um, it's not only sharing, sometimes there has to be some influence. I'll give an example of lifestyle, for example. People's lifestyles are always a bit tricky. Some people think that the way they're living is okay, right? And then when you look at the way they're living, you're saying, no, but this way of life is affecting your health, or it's affecting the quality of your life. What if you try ABCD? Sometimes then there's a need for influence to come in, right? You have to be convincing in order to tell someone, or to have a discourse around, for example, smoking. How do you negotiate or influence someone to stop, right? So those are the things that the role of discourse in communication networks. And then last but not least, identity construction. So it is through the use of language and symbolic representation that a discourse contributes to the construction and maintenance of individual and collective identity. It is through discussions that you sit down with your family and they tell you that we, the people of, we are like this, we do this. This is the way we've done things, but this is the way we want them done. So identities, I know a lot of people often think that identity doesn't change, but it does. It should actually, to an extent, improve. You can't just keep and say, that's the way I am. And there's some people who are like that. Even some cultures, like, this is who we are, and that it's not going to change. But through discourse, you might then get to realize that, oh, okay, we've had these traditions, we've had these cultures. Are they helping us or they harming us? And so through the use of language and, symbolic representations, whether it's film, whether it's art, um, you know, individuals and collective identities such as communities, societies, begin to rethink or foster a sense of belonging and shared purpose in their activities, in their behaviors and attitudes as a group or even as an individual. And this is most likely best to happen through discourse. Now, I'm going to analyze discourse in communication networks in brief. So when you are analyzing discourse, there are 4 ways of doing it. So number 1, content analysis. This is where you examine the themes, patterns, and semantic structures within the actual texts, written word, spoken word, which is verbal communication, exchanged within the network to uncover underlying meanings and narratives, right? So how do people talk to each other? What do people write to each other? Like the content analysis. What are the themes? What do people mostly talk about? Of course, there's an example of the video in Kenya of the pastor who said that people always talking about relationships, this, relationships, that, and he was bemoaning that there's too much talk of relationship. People should also talk about business and improving, their life and all that. And of course, there was a bit of a debate, but it's good to have that content analysis. What are people interested in talking about? Why are they interested in talking about it? And how often do they talk about it? That's when you talk about patterns, right? And then the second part is narrative analysis. So you explore the stories, the metaphors, and of course, rhetorical devices. What sort of stories do people tell most of the time? When I was a teacher, one of the things that I was teaching writing for new journalism students. And the first exercise was for them to write a story, a fictional story. And almost always, 3/4 of the stories that the students would write in Namibia, in this college that I was in, was a rags to riches story. A girl who comes from the village, who was abused in some way, emotionally, physically, and then he or she gets the opportunity to go to town, and they meet bad friends, they learn their lesson, they go to church. At church, they get someone who advises them. and then they go to school, and then they become a rich and powerful person. Almost always. The story might have been slightly different, but those were the stories that they would tell. And it was quite interesting to analyze those narratives, of course, and the metaphors. Um, Metaphors are usually surrounding the experience of the society or the community all the time. And of course, the rhetoric devices. How do people speak to each other? Are they filled with sarcasm? Are they filled with jokes? You know, we find that Kenyans, Zimbabweans, and South Africans often tend to lean towards jokes, with, especially in terms of politics. Um, why do they do it that way? How come people are good at making jokes or caricatures of political situations? And then in analyzing discourse, you can also look at social network analysis, mapping the connections and relationships between network actors, right? Who, how are people relating to each other? So that's the connections. How do people do business to each other? How do they communicate? Which organizations always do collaborations, for example. So that's when you're looking at relationships between network actors and analyzing how those the structures of those networks shape the flow and dynamics of discourse within the network. And then last but not least, you can do what is called the critical discourse analysis, where you examine the power dynamics. Who says what and everybody jumps? Who has ideologies, whose ideas or line of thought influence everyone? And of course, the social inequalities. Who is not allowed to speak, or who, when they speak, is ignored? And you can assess these and how they're reflected and reinforced through the discursive practices within the communication network. Now, how methodologies for discourse analysis? I'm going to just go through these. These are academic methodologies for discourse analysis. But before I get into that, just to say that discourse analysis can be done in these 7 ways. Either you look at genre, conversations, mediated discourse, multimodal discourse analysis, critical discourse, pragmatics, the ethnography of speaking. I'm not going to go into detail with this because, of course, of my time limit, but you feel free to read further on discourse analysis. And if you need, maybe you can get in touch with me and we can have a discussion. But looking at methodologies, of course, being academic, you can have the qualitative approach. This is where you have in-depth interviews, focus groups, and even textual analysis to gain a rich contextual understanding of discursive practices. Then quantitative techniques. Now you look at natural language processes. You can do what is called sentiment analysis. Do you like this? Do you like it when preachers shout, yes or no? And then 50 people liked it when their preachers speak loudly and they're shouting, you see, that sort of thing. Sentiment analysis. You can also look at topic modeling and network analysis, which leverage on computational tools so that you can identify patterns, trends, and relationships within the large-scale communication data. Of course, there are the mixed methods strategies, and these, they combine the qualitative and quantitative methods so that you have a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the interplay between discourse, network dynamics, and broader social context. And then the interdisciplinary approach. This is interesting. This is where you integrate insights from various fields such as linguistics, sociology, psychology, mathematics, and communication studies to develop holistic and multifaceted frameworks for analyzing discourse in communication networks. Now, what are the practical applications of discourse analysis and communication networks? The first is social media, right? And I don't mean like Facebook or Instagram. I mean the media within society, right? Analyzing, well, of course, also those social media platforms. So you could analyze social media, the discourse that happens on social media platforms so that you can understand public opinion. Is it real public opinion? Do people just follow what someone says in comments, and if they find it interesting, they can copy it? So, like, for example, one of the most interesting comments I would see on YouTube is, "I'm no longer a fan, I'm now an air conditioner." It's a play on words, right? But you can also see how someone would say it and then influence other people to also say it, which is quite interesting. And then also you can look at the spread of information. What information is spread faster than other information? And then organizational communications, they can use that. They can use discourse analysis to examine the discursive practices and power dynamics within organizational communication networks. And this will help to enhance internal collaboration, decision-making, and knowledge sharing. Crisis communication, or communicators can also look into communication networks to leverage discourse analysis in order to navigate the complexities of crisis communication networks, right? When there's a crisis, who do you go to? How do you go to them? When do you go to them? To identify, of course, the key narratives, develop effective response strategies within a crisis. And then last but not least is the public policy. How do we apply discourse analysis? Oh, the public policy should apply discourse analysis to understand the framing, negotiating, and implementation of public policies, right, within the broader communication networks, which often involves government, stakeholders, and the public at large. What are the challenges and limitations of discourse analysis? The first, of course, is context dependency. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Meaning and significance of discourse are heavily influenced by specific cultural, social, and historical contexts. How people take something, how people understand a message, right, is influenced by that. So it makes it very challenging. You can't just say, oh, when we spoke to young women, they thought ABCD, because young women in Brazil and in North Carolina, America, or in Australia, Perth, or here in Meru, for example, they're very different. So you cannot say because we did our discourse analysis in one place, it's going to work the same in another. And then interpretive nature. So discourse often relies on how someone interprets them and their levels of interpretive skills and theoretical perspectives of sometimes even the researcher. So the researcher can introduce inherent biases and subjective interpretations of the data. So of course, it's never, when you are doing discourse analysis, you have to remember that you are not a vacuum, you are not coming from nowhere, you've got your own way of thinking, and it will influence how you see things and how people communicate. And then the availability of data and access. Gaining access to and analyzing the vast amounts of data generated within complex networks can be logistically a nightmare. It can have technologically, it can be challenging. Now imagine if you're still going to some government offices where they still use wads and wads of paper. How are you going to put it down? And maybe you want to put it into computers. That is difficult. And even getting information from one department to another. Maybe you want to know things about trade. How are you going to get information from trade so that you put it into Ministry of Communication? So also cases of privacy and encrypted communication channels, they can also be blockers to your access. And then ethical consideration. Of course, discourse analysis and communication raises very, very critical ethical concerns around privacy, consent, and potential misuse of sensitive data. So, of course, we would like to know, what do people talk about? What do husbands and wives talk about? Mothers to their children, friends. But then a lot of communication tends to be intimate, tends to be private. Now, even if you tell people like this is an academic endeavor, people can be mistrusting to that effect. And because they don't want that information maybe to be used against them, because it could be sensitive data. and requires extreme consideration. And then to implement robust data governance protocols should it be used at policy making levels. I'm now rounding up, and I'm just going to share my thoughts about this whole situation of communication networks and discourse analysis. So, of course, unfortunately, a lot of the studies that have been done have the context of communication networks, even when it started, was highly Western in approach, with little to no studies done specific to the dynamics of African communication styles, of which those still might need to be identified explicitly, right? As I am very much an African scholar and Pan-Africanist. So for me, every time I read these theories or approaches, I always think, what about in Africa? Have we got our own models? What do we think? How does this work in our context? Of course, I like that it is in the study of communication networks, there is that acknowledgement that it has to be contextual. Then there's also a need to further explore the limitations within networks, about the potential negative association with other networks that could present advantages to one node and prove to be a threat to another. So, for example, there's that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Does that always work? It's something that I always wonder, is it a practical way of networking? And then there's also you find, like, remember we're talking about the power dynamics. So if you become a very close friend of one of the powerful nodes in a network, for example, and they tell you not to befriend another powerful node, what happens? What are the dynamics associated with that? And then last but not least, with more non-hierarchical structures on the increase, what effect, I had a question, what effect does this imply on the development of networks? So these are also further areas of study that any of you could take up, right? So in conclusion, the study of discourse within various networks remains a very critical area of research and practice. By leveraging a range of methodological approaches, which I highlighted earlier, and interdisciplinary perspectives, which are very important in this day and age, scholars and professionals can deepen their understanding of the role of language, power, and social dynamics, especially those three, in shaping the flow of information, the construction of meaning, and collective behavior within society's communication networks. And there is, of course, the need to integrate emerging technologies such as AI and big data analytics, which will likely expand the frontiers of discourse analysis to enable a more comprehensive and real-time insights into the intricate workings of these communication networks across the various social, economic, and political domains. So thank you so much for listening to me for so long. If you still have questions or if you've got some inputs, again, please do not hesitate to send me comments in my channel, or if you have my direct contacts, just get in touch with me and we can take this conversation further. Thank you and have a good day.